presentation, which will be given by Mr. Phil Glendenning. And to just give a brief introduction to Phil, Phil has a background in education and political science. He's the director of the Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education in Sydney, Australia. And he has a long track record in human rights, in dealing with climate change, peace and reconciliation. And in 2021, he became president of the Refugee Council of Australia. He has done tremendous work on behalf of asylum seekers, and he has been concerned about their safety in detention centres and how they've been treated by the Australian government. I'll also mention a number of awards he received for documentaries that he's made, and I'll mention two of these documentaries. One is called Stop the Boats. You know about the boats bringing asylum seekers to Australia, not being allowed to land in Australia. And another documentary called Deported to Danger. And both these documentaries got a major awards. So Phil, we're looking forward to hearing your presentation about how is advocacy a pillar of the work of the Edmund Rice Justice Centre in Sydney. Over to you, Phil.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. It's a great pleasure to be here. I remember that chapter in 2002 when the sort of land-breaking decision was made for the congregation and congregations to embrace advocacy as a pillar of the mission, and it was inspiring then, and it's inspiring now to reflect back and to consider that where we are 20 years later. So congratulations to all those who made this possible. For us in Oceania and in the Edmund Rice Centre, advocacy has been a fundamental plank of our work since day one. That's 25 years ago. And it's based fundamentally in sort of four simple concepts. One, based in the importance of relationships, that we're not working for people, we're working with people. And that we're amplifying the voice of others, not taking their space to fill it up with our voice. Secondly, in the words of Albert Nolan, if we're going to get serious about advocacy, we have to take sides. So we stand on the side of those who are oppressed and marginalised, rather than stand in the centre in some sort of way of saying, oh, there are two sides to the story. Well, often there aren't two sides to the story. And it's one of the things that really annoyed me about the United Nations International Year of Tolerance, because there are some things you just can't tolerate, like sexism, like misogyny, like domestic violence, like racism. And that there are moments when we have to say, we have to take a stand, and that stand is determined on who we stand with. And so, which brings me to the third pillar of this, which is it's a work of faith. It's a fundamental work of faith, as Edmund himself demonstrated when he opened the Richmond Street School, and 100,000 people turned up to hear Daniel O'Connell speak and open that school, which was about confronting the status quo. Jesus Christ got crucified for it. I think it's one of the great joys of the Edmund Rice congregation and network around the years is that people are doing this. We see it in the schools, we see it through Edmund Rice Beyond Borders. But occasionally, when and if you do that, you're going to find it will attract criticism. And so I think we have to remember that if we're going to be serious about advocacy, and if you're over the target, you're going to get flack. And in lots of ways, that's a measure of the significance of what we're trying to do. So I also have a little presentation I'd like to share, which is just running through, I better turn the share screen on first, Phil. Running through some images of our work in Oceania and around the world in recent years. Okay, we've got to go to slideshow. From the beginning, okay. Right, well, this, ladies and gentlemen, is the actual map of Australia. It's what it looked like in the at the time that the first boatload of unauthorised arrivals came to these shores in 1770 and came back to stay in 1788. Now, these are the Aboriginal people. And as is our tradition in Australia, I want to pay my homage and respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging, of all of those nations that make up this country. But the history has not been, as you probably be aware, has not been a pleasant one. And for many years, the government tried to say that the Aboriginal people didn't belong here. And we joined with others. This is a thing called the Sea of Hands. That was an advocacy strategy used by the Edmund Rice Centre and others in Australia to demonstrate support for the Aboriginal people and their rights to land. And what you're looking at here is 210,000 plastic hands on Bondi Beach, each with a name on it of an Australian who said they want to see justice done for Aboriginal people. And we used this tactic because it was, up until that point, the government were quite prepared to ignore the views of Aboriginal people. And so this was in support of Aboriginal people and their rights to land, which they subsequently got. And to this day, the organisation that emerged out of this is called Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation, and it is still functioning and going very well to this day. The second group of people we were concerned about, and I don't apologise for this image, it's horrific, and I use it deliberately, were those who were the last to arrive in Australia. And these are people seeking asylum. This is an image coming from Quetta in Afghanistan. These gentlemen have just had a bomb, Quetta in Pakistan, over the border from Afghanistan. A bomb has just gone off. This is 9 years ago. And you can see that the Hazara minority men run out to pick up the dead and the dying. And to this day, these events are still happening. I was talking to someone earlier today in Kabul, where another bomb has gone off this afternoon and killing another 50 people. But the thing that I want to bring to your attention here, besides the horror, is up the back, you see a big poster that was put there by the Australian government that says, don't risk your life going to Australia by boat. And so it seemed to us when we saw this event that at the same time, we in the Edmund Rice movement were providing school support in various parts of the province for refugees who'd recently arrived, providing some housing services. It seemed to us that we also at the same time had to deal with the cause of the oppression and this is the oppression that was being conducted by our government, who took these people from this scene and put them out on remote Pacific islands in detention. And so as Kevin generously explained earlier, this led to us making a series of reports to the United Nations and then taking this to the Australian government. The good news is that out of that work, the deportations of people back to this situation stopped, and that work was used in France and Germany and the United Kingdom to stop their governments deporting people as well. The sad thing is, of course, Afghanistan at the moment is in a similar situation. Then I come to the third group that have come to our attention of late, and this is the people of the Pacific who are facing climate change. This is the main island of Tarawa, and I like to say that we work in our part of the world with the first peoples, the Aboriginal people, the last to arrive, the refugees and the asylum seekers, and those who will come next. And these are the people of the Pacific. This is a coral atoll. On that stretch, it doesn't look like you can believe what I'm about to tell you. 55,000 people live on that island. And it is every year getting smaller and smaller. They say living on Kiribati is like living on a boat. Every year the boat gets smaller and more people get on board. So to that end, we are working with the governments of Kiribati and Tuvalu at the moment to see if we can work with them and again, through the United Nations, I want to pay great tribute to ERI's work here in supporting the former president of Kiribati, Ngāi Tong, to bring this situation to the world's attention. That climate change is real, and the young people in the schools are now demanding that this has to be addressed. And it's a great privilege to see. Now, I've got a couple of quick lessons here before I wrap up. What have we learnt in our work in advocacy in Australia? Firstly, that the lessons of history are real. Aboriginal people lived in our country for 65,000 years. It's the world's oldest continuing culture. And rather than think that they've got to be fixed up, what the government often thinks, they've probably got something right and the rest of us have something to learn. So a lot of advocacy, therefore, is about listening. We've got to use multiple strategies. I've got a number of them listed there. I won't read them out. I'm assuming everybody can read. The other thing we've learned is to make the connections, to don't just become focused on one issue, but point to the human rights and the environmental rights and focus on the change. And as Kevin said before, change can take a hell of a long time to happen. That's true, but change does happen. And we see it in the women's movement, the peace movement, the anti-nuclear movement, the anti-apartheid movement, where people join together to take joint action and don't wait for the governments to act. The international human rights structures we have provide a great leverage for change.
Give them a comment at the end.
And that change happens, I think, when loose and shifting coalitions come together to take action. So finally, I want to just say, but effective advocacy from our point of view requires skills and relationships with real people. Know them. In the old days, you used to say you had to think locally and act globally. I think now we have to think and act locally and globally in partnership with others. So finally, Edmund Rice advocacy. It's about voting with your feet. Our view of the world is determined by where we stand and who we stand with. It's about faith. And as the theologian José Combin used to say, it's a choice between the gospel pole or the religious pole. The gospel pole sends us back to the social reality, which is messy, and with people live real human lives, or the religious pole, which requires rules and regulations and a priestly caste and hierarchical structures. I think our faith is about saying this is a gospel-based part of our work. How do we know we're doing our advocacy properly? We ask ourselves three questions. And can we say yes to these three questions? Do the needs of the poor take priority over the wants of the rich? Does the freedom of the weak take priority over the liberty of the powerful? Does the access of marginalised groups in society and the marginalised earth itself take priority over the maintenance of an order that excludes them? If we can't say yes to those three things, I would say our advocacy might be really good, but it won't necessarily be faith-based. It won't be what Edmund would have done, and it wouldn't be Christian. But ultimately, it comes back to people, and this is my mate Rezai, who is in the man I was talking to, who is in Dasti Bachi in Western Kabul in Afghanistan, who has seen relatives and friends slaughtered recently, and who has applied to the Australian government and the Canadian government. He has been an interpreter to those governments, and he and his 6 children and his wife are in hiding as we speak tonight. His humanity demands our compassion. His humanity is clear evidence of why advocacy is an important part of the mission of our congregation. Or as my young son gave me about 5 years ago, after hearing some of my Afghan mates talk, he said, "I think this is what you blokes are about, Dad." It's a Banksy picture of we've got to spread the love and the truth around. Thanks, Kevin.
So thank you very much, Phil, again, for highlighting your work, particularly for the things you mentioned at the beginning about the importance of relationships and taking a stand. And I liked your questions at the end about how are we doing. I think those were 3 quite penetrating questions you left us with there at the end. I think too, your mention of, the importance of listening, and that has come out, I think, too, in other people's presentations. So now, so we're coming to the end now, and I'm just conscious we've gone a little bit over the time, but I want to invite each of our panelists just to make one comment at the end of this particular webinar. One thing they want to say very briefly as we wrap up the webinar. So we'll begin with Brother Martin Keneally. So Martin, over to you.
One minute, Martin. 1 minute. Let me just unmute you. Okay. Just a moment. Okay. All right, Martin, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kevin and Tino. For me, this morning was gave me a lot of energy and hope from listening to participants and indeed to the other speakers. And I am conscious as well that the whole church is talking about this word of synodality, which of course people wonder, will it do anything? Will anything change? But I think we need to be part of that bigger movement because it has the potential to revolutionize the way ministry and mission is exercised in the wider church. And I think we should make, as people involved in advocacy, be seen to create a church that is a church of advocacy. And I think there's an opportunity because it's probably going to be the greatest consultation in the history of the church. And we at least need to approach that positively and make our strong contribution to that when it's happening, wherever we are.
Thank you very much, Martin. So Sneha, over to you for a brief comment again on what you take away from this webinar.
Thank you so much, Brother Kevin. For me, when I look at it, for us, advocacy is a work of justice and participation in the transformation of the entire world, which is constitutive dimension of preaching the gospel. So I feel so happy and thrilled. This has been reinforced. This is a Synod of Bishops 1971, which brought us to transformation of the world. And again, we are talking of synodality, participation of people, of everyone. No one should be left behind. And this platform, when we are talking, we need to act justly, love tenderly, and walk humbly with our God, with others, in partnership and with Mother Earth. So I feel that this regional level, at national and international level, we've got to build highly participatory and consultative processes to begin change at micro and macro level. And hence, how, where, and when we are going to do is what defines advocacy. And it's a collective efforts of taking a spiritual journey for a purpose to build up a human and dignified world, which Christ built on gospels. So that's what I believe advocacy is all about.
Thank you, Sneha, very much. And over to you, Phil, for your final word.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks to everybody who's attended from whatever part of the world you're in. Look, I'm just reflecting on the fact that a conversation I had this afternoon, someone saying, oh, you know, I'm too old to be involved in this, or another younger person said, I'm not experienced enough. It seems to me we underestimate the importance of right relationships, which actually means witness, which actually translates to solidarity. You know, that we're all close enough to people who live lives on the edges to make solidarity real in their lives, you know. So I would encourage people, if you're interested in advocacy, to reach out to another human person. And yes, there are practical things you can do in terms of writing letters and lobbying politicians and spreading educational awareness. But if you can get to know a face and a name and put a face to a name and a name to a face, please do so. And the second thing is, you know, I think we shouldn't do this alone. One of the great things that ERI has done, I think, has been a witness of, is the importance of partnership on the ground, particularly in Geneva, but in giving voice to people from the Caribbean, from Africa, in the place in Geneva where the world comes to sort out its problems. They go to New York to discuss the problems and complain about everything. They go to Geneva to try and work out a solution. And I just think my final word is to thank the members of the ERI team, Kevin, Tino, Brian, to say thank you for the work you do on behalf of us congregations and people who are hopefully still the true believers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. So just to say a final word, I want to thank our three panelists for their joining us and for their presentations. So thank you, Martin, thank you, Sneha, and thank you, Phil. And thank you also to all our participants. And maybe my final word would be, I think we heard mention during the presentations of the importance of spirituality, the spiritual basis of our advocacy work. And I think it's good to be reminded about that, to come back to that basis And also then to remember too, the whole thing about patience, that maybe change happens slowly, but we keep making the effort. We don't give up. There's still hope. And I think Edmund Rice had his own difficulties and challenges, but he continued right to the end. So let us be the same. And I wish you all a good celebration of the Feast of Blessed Edmund on the 5th of May. Many thanks. Over to you, Tino, to conclude.